year was 1852, and the oppressive heat of a southern summer weighed heavily on Willow Creek Plantation, nestled deep in the heart of Georgia. Thomas Bogard, a prosperous plantation owner, had always believed in the strength of his family's legacy. He had inherited the plantation from his father, along with the enslaved workers who toiled the fields, cultivating cotton from the rich soil that seemed endless. But beneath the gleaming columns of the grand estate, something dark stirred. Thomas's wife, Ella, had always been the epitome of grace. Yet, for the past 7 years of their marriage, whispers surrounded them. Whispers that the woman, though beloved in the eyes of society, had failed to give Thomas an heir, a constant source of stress, particularly for his overbearing mother. 3 miscarriages had left Ella fragile, retreating into herself with each loss, and the toll it had taken on her body and mind had become evident. One humid April evening, as mockingbirds filled the air with their eerie melodies, Ella entered her husband's study, her face pale and eyes wide with concern. There was something out in the east field, she said, something not quite right. The man who stood there, watching their home, wasn't one of their workers. His eyes, Ella insisted, were like no others she had ever seen. Thomas laughed it off. "You've been reading too many of those Boston Gothic novels," he teased, dismissing her growing fears. But the figure in the field wasn't the only strange occurrence. So sit back, relax, and grab your popcorn. This is a tale that will make you question everything. Subscribe to Grave of the Shadows for more mysteries like this, and leave a comment to let us know your thoughts. Willow Creek Plantation stood as a monument to the wealth and power of the Bogard family, its white columns gleaming in the southern sun like the proud pillars of an empire. Stretching over 2,000 acres of fertile land, it commanded the horizon, with cotton fields that seemed to stretch endlessly, their white blooms reminiscent of the clouds that drifted lazily across the sky. Yet beneath the beauty of the land, beneath the polished appearance of the plantation house, a darker current ran, one that would soon pull its inhabitants into a vortex of fear and suspicion. Thomas Bogard sat at his desk in the study, his brow furrowed as he pored over the plantation's accounts. The steady tick of the clock on the wall seemed to underscore the relentless march of time, but in his mind, he was distracted by thoughts of expansion. The previous season's harvest had been bountiful, and the business seemed poised for even greater prosperity. Yet, as always, there was one cloud that loomed above his wife, Ella. She had always been a calm, composed woman, her beauty and grace admired by their peers. But for the last several years, there had been whispers about her inability to give Thomas an heir, whispers that had become a source of deep disappointment, especially for Thomas's mother, who made no effort to hide her growing disdain. 3 miscarriages had left Ella fragile, both physically and emotionally, and she had retreated further into herself with each passing year. The latest loss, just months ago, had nearly claimed her life. The door creaked open, and Ella entered, her steps hesitant. She paused for a moment in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with an expression that Thomas couldn't quite place. "Thomas, there's something in the east field," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Something not right." Thomas barely glanced up, his attention still fixed on the ledges before him. "What do you mean, Ella? Speak clearly." "I saw a man there this morning," she said, her voice barely audible, standing still as a statue among the cotton, just watching the house. Thomas sighed and looked up, raising an eyebrow. "One of the field hands, I presume?" "No." Ella shook her head slowly, her voice shaking. "Not one of ours. I've never seen him before. He was tall, with strange eyes like I've never seen." Thomas laughed, the sound sharp and disbelieving. "You've been reading too many of those Gothic novels from Boston, Ella. Probably just a vagrant passing through. I'll have Jackson check the perimeter." But Ella didn't smile. She remained standing in the doorway, her eyes distant. "He looked at me, Thomas, directly at me." The days that followed were filled with an increasing sense of unease. Ella once composed demeanor began to unravel, like threads coming loose from a tightly woven fabric. Each morning, She would walk through the house, her eyes searching the rooms as if expecting something, someone, lurking in the shadows. Yet, when she spoke of her fears, Thomas dismissed them. He was far more concerned with the business of the plantation than his wife's growing paranoia. The strange figure, the man she had seen standing among the cotton, didn't disappear. In fact, Evelina would spot him again, standing by the old well near the western boundary, beneath the willow tree by the creek, and at the edge of the family cemetery where Thomas's ancestors lay buried. Each time, she documented the sightings with increasing precision. The time of day, the position of the man, and the uncomfortable chill that crept down her spine with each glance. She told no one but Thomas and Sarah, the elderly servant who had been with the family since Thomas's childhood, but neither of them took her concerns seriously. Thomas, wrapped in his own thoughts about expanding the plantation, barely registered her unease. "Perhaps you need to rest, Evelina," he suggested one evening, his voice flat as he shuffled through the accounts. "You've been under a great deal of stress lately. The pressure of running this place, the disappointment of not having a child." His voice trailed off, and for a moment there was a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, but he quickly masked it. "The child will come. I know it." But Evelina wasn't convinced. The closer she got to her due date, the more she felt a presence that seemed to follow her everywhere. At night, when she would sit by the window in the nursery, the room that had been prepared after each of her previous miscarriages, she would stare out at the fields, her mind swirling with confusion and dread. "Sarah," Evelina whispered one night as the servant brought in a tray of tea, "I don't think this child is mine." Sarah, startled, paused in the doorway. "What do you mean, Miss Evelina?" "I don't know how to explain it," Evelina murmured, her hand resting on her growing belly. "But it doesn't feel right. Something is wrong with me, Sarah. I feel like I'm growing inside the child, instead of it growing inside me." Sarah, who had witnessed Evelina's pain after the previous miscarriages, said nothing. Instead, she quietly set down the tea and took a seat beside her, as if knowing that words would do little to comfort the troubled woman. The growing fear in Evelina's heart was palpable, and though Thomas may have dismissed her concerns, there was one thing he couldn't ignore. The strange occurrences began to multiply. Late one evening, as he walked through the property, he caught sight of the same figure, standing just beyond the trees at the edge of the cemetery. Thomas froze. His heart beat faster as he stared into the distance, uncertain if it was the alcohol from his earlier drink clouding his senses. But the man in the field, tall and motionless, was undeniably real. Still, the questions lingered. Who was he? Why was he watching? And why did Evelina seem so certain that the man was connected to their unborn child? As the spring of 1852 turned to summer, Evelina's pregnancy advanced, but so did her fears. The strange man who had first appeared in the East Field was no longer a mere figure in the distance. He had become a constant presence in her mind, a symbol of everything that felt wrong in her life. No longer able to dismiss the unease that had settled deep within her, Evelina began to isolate herself from the household. Her once warm and caring demeanor had shifted into something more withdrawn, a quiet anxiety that only grew as the months passed. One evening, while she was in the nursery, staring at the rocking chair that had been prepared for the child, Sarah approached her hesitantly. "Miss Evelina," she began softly, "the baby is growing so quickly." Evelina glanced up from the window, where the evening light filtered through the curtains like soft threads of gold. "Yes," she replied, her voice low and distant. "But it doesn't feel like he's mine, Sarah. It's as if I'm growing inside him, not the other way around." Sarah frowned, concerned for her mistress's state of mind. "Perhaps you need to speak with Dr. Williams again. He's always said that this is a natural part of the process." But Evelina shook her head, her eyes wide. "No, Sarah, this isn't natural. There's something wrong. The baby is different." As if on cue, Thomas entered the room, his brow furrowed in concern. "Evelina," he said gently, his voice taking on an almost pleading tone, "you must stop this. There is nothing wrong with you or the baby. You're just anxious, that's all. The doctor has already reassured us." But Evelina wasn't listening. Her thoughts were elsewhere, drifting to the memories of the mysterious figure she had seen, standing motionless at the edges of the property. She had spotted him again that morning, just as the sun had risen, his figure stark against the dawn light. And then something had changed in her, an unshakable certainty that he wasn't just a stranger. He had been watching them, waiting for something. But what? The whispers among the household staff grew louder. Sarah had noticed Evelina's strange behavior, how she would stare out of windows at nothing, how she would speak in low, cryptic tones when no one was around. A few servants had even seen her walking alone at night, heading towards the east field, the area where the man had been first sighted. But it wasn't until Evelina's increasing isolation led her to visit the family cemetery late one evening that the truth began to reveal itself. There, beneath the ancient oaks, she stood motionless, staring at the graves of Thomas's ancestors. It was as though something within her had connected, like a thread pulling her to a place she had never truly seen before. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, a voice broke the silence. "You know the truth, Evelina. He's not yours," the voice whispered, though no one was there. Evelina felt a cold chill grip her heart as she turned to see the figure, the man, standing just beyond the cemetery. His strange, luminous eyes locked with hers, and for the first time, she didn't feel fear. Instead, there was a sense of recognition, as if this moment had been written in the stars, as if she had always known him. At that moment, the flood of memories, lost, hidden, and locked away, came rushing back, but they weren't her memories. They were his. The realization hit her like a thunderclap. The child she carried wasn't just her husband's heir. He belonged to something else, something far older and more terrifying than she had ever imagined. When Evelina returned to the house that evening, shaken to her core, she spoke to no one. Her mind raced with questions that she could not yet answer. But as the days passed, the changes in her were becoming too obvious to ignore. Her belly swelled unnaturally fast, and she felt a sense of power inside her that she had never known before. It was as though something was awakening inside her, a presence that seemed far beyond the child she carried. And then, on a humid evening in late June, Evelina's condition took an unexpected turn. The doctor, upon his visit, seemed equally alarmed by her rapid physical change. Dr. Williams, though offering a comforting smile, couldn't mask his concern. "Evelina," he said with a nervous chuckle, "I've seen many expectant mothers, but this is most unusual. The child seems to be growing at an alarming rate. I would advise rest and calm, but there is nothing I can find that points to any danger." But Evelina was beyond reassurance. The presence in her, whether it was the child or something else, had consumed her mind. She was no longer the woman she had been. She was a vessel, waiting for something or someone to claim her. The days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Evelina's growing sense of dread became impossible to ignore. Her once careful movements now betrayed a frantic energy as she paced the hallways of the plantation house, her hands pressed to her swollen belly. She had no answers, only a gnawing fear that clung to her like a second skin. And yet, the arrival of the child was imminent, the finality of it hanging over her like a dark storm cloud. It was a storm that came without warning. On September 15th, a thunderstorm of unparalleled intensity struck Calhoun County. The winds howled and raged, uprooting ancient oaks along the plantation's drive, and lightning lit up the night sky like flashes of white-hot fire. Thomas had retreated to his study with a bottle of bourbon, hoping to wait out the storm in solitude. But the house seemed to hum with an energy that kept him from finding peace. There was something in the air, something in Evelina's presence, that he could no longer ignore. It was Sarah who found her first, pacing back and forth in the nursery. The wind outside was a relentless roar, but Evelina's eyes were fixed on the window, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the sill. Her face was pale, a ghostly reflection of the woman she had once been. "Miss Evelina," Sarah called gently, but there was no response. The sound of thunder rattled the windows, but Elalina's gaze never shifted. "I have to go," Elalina whispered under her breath, her voice thin and strained. "He's coming. He's finally coming." Before Sarah could reach her, Elalina stumbled out of the room, her hand pressed to her stomach, a grim determination in her eyes. Sarah's heart raced as she followed, but Elalina's pace only quickened. The hallway seemed to stretch before her, the walls closing in as though the house itself were conspiring to hold her back. She reached the stairs and began to descend, her footfalls echoing in the emptiness below. By the time Sarah reached the bottom of the staircase, Elalina was already in the front hall, clutching at her belly as if she were holding on to something far deeper than mere flesh. A single cry broke from her lips, piercing the night air, and Sarah gasped in horror. The baby was coming now. The storm outside intensified, the rain pouring down in sheets, the winds howling with an almost otherworldly force. Inside the house, the tension was palpable. Thomas, hearing his wife's cries, stood frozen in the doorway of the room where Elalina had been laid out in a makeshift bed. The servants rushed around, preparing to help, but it was clear that something wasn't right. As Elalina's labor progressed, the sound of her pain seemed to become more intense, more otherworldly. The room was dim, lit only by the flickering flames of the fireplace, the shadows playing along the walls as the storm outside raged on. The midwife, a stern woman named Mrs. Hamilton, stood at the foot of the bed, her brow furrowed as she assessed the situation. "It's too fast," she muttered under her breath. "The child isn't waiting. It's coming too quickly." But Thomas couldn't focus on the woman's words. His eyes were fixed on his wife, whose face was contorted in pain as her body seemed to betray her. The child was coming in a way that defied all logic, and it was as though Elalina was no longer in control. With one final, heart-wrenching cry, Elalina collapsed against the pillows, her body shuddering with the effort. And then, in the silence that followed, the unmistakable sound of a baby's first cry filled the room. The child was born, but Thomas could not bring himself to look at the baby. Not at first. He had seen the physical toll of childbirth on Elalina, her pale face, her damp skin, but it was the child's eyes that held his attention. He could feel them before he saw them. They were different, too different, and when he finally dared to look, he was struck by a horrible realization. The baby's eyes were not like his own. They were not like Elalina's either. The child's eyes were amber, glowing faintly in the low light, with vertical pupils that seemed to pulse with an unnatural intensity. "Elalina!" Thomas breathed, his voice tight with disbelief. "What is this?" The woman who had once been his wife looked at him, through eyes that were no longer human. Her lips curved into a small, cryptic smile. "He has been watching us," she said softly, her voice calm despite the chaos of the moment. "And now, he no longer needs to wait." Thomas recoiled from the child, his mind spinning as he tried to process what he was seeing. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing against him as if the very house were suffocating him. His heart raced, and for the first time since he had inherited Willow Creek, Thomas felt fear. Who is the father of this child? Thomas demanded, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. Elalina's expression remained serene, unshaken by his anger. "He has been waiting," she whispered again, "and now it is time for him to take his place. As for the father, perhaps the question you should ask is why you never saw him before." The days following the birth were shrouded in a strange and oppressive silence. The grand halls of Willow Creek, once filled with the hum of daily activity, now felt eerily still. Thomas, his mind consumed with thoughts of the child and the haunting certainty that something otherworldly had entered their lives, withdrew into himself. His once firm, steady demeanor cracked, and he became a shadow of the man he had been. Elalina, on the other hand, seemed to recover rapidly. Her physical health improved far beyond what was normal, her complexion radiant, her movements fluid. She no longer seemed the fragile woman she once was. There was a sense of calm in her eyes, almost an otherworldly peace. It was as though the child she had borne had breathed new life into her, one that defied the natural course of events. But it was the child that held Thomas's gaze the longest. James, as he was now named, never cried. He never whimpered when hungry, and no one could remember the last time he had been bathed in the same way as a typical infant. He seemed to observe everything around him, his amber eyes flashing with an awareness that no newborn should possess. His gaze, steady and unsettling, tracked movement as if he understood far more than any child should. As weeks passed, Thomas began to avoid the nursery altogether. He found himself dreading the sight of his son, unable to bring himself to look directly at him. And yet, every time he caught a glimpse of James, it was as if the child were watching him back, watching with an intelligence that chilled him to the bone. One night, Thomas entered the nursery unannounced. His footsteps were silent on the creaky wooden floors, and as he approached the crib, he froze. There, in the dim light, Evelina was kneeling beside the child. But this time, she wasn't just looking at him. She was speaking in a language he didn't understand, her voice low and rhythmic, a chant that seemed to echo against the walls. Her eyes were wide with a kind of reverence, as though she were in the presence of something divine, or perhaps something far darker. When she noticed Thomas, she smiled, but it was not the smile of the woman he had once known. There was something eerie about it, something that made his skin crawl. "He's ready now," Evelina whispered, her voice soft but tinged with something otherworldly. "The child, he is not like us." Thomas stepped back, his heart pounding. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "What is this?" Evelina turned to face him, her expression calm but distant, as though she had already made peace with the truth. "You knew," she said, her gaze not leaving his. "From the beginning you knew, but you chose to ignore it. Now it is too late." The storm outside, which had been a distant hum throughout the evening, began to rise again, louder, more intense. The wind howled through the trees, and the house seemed to shake under the pressure of the storm. The tension in the room was palpable, and for the first time, Thomas felt a deep, primal fear settle in his chest. Something was coming, something he could no longer deny. The next morning, the servants awoke to an unusual silence. The house, once a bustling center of activity, now felt abandoned. Evelina and James were nowhere to be found, and Thomas, though physically present, seemed distant, his eyes hollow and unfocused. The household staff reported that Evelina had dismissed half of the staff without consulting Thomas, leaving only a few trusted servants to care for the estate. Those who remained whispered among themselves of her strange behavior, the long walks at dawn, the cryptic conversations, and her obsession with the phases of the moon. It was as though Evelina had retreated entirely into a world of her own, one that Thomas could no longer reach. By mid-December, the situation had become unbearable. Thomas, unable to cope with the tension and uncertainty surrounding his wife and child, made arrangements to send Evelina and James away. He had decided to relocate them to a coastal property in Brunswick, away from the prying eyes of society and the growing whispers among the locals. But what happened next would forever change the course of the Bogard family's history. On January 10th, 1853, a fire broke out at the Brunswick property. The fire consumed the house so quickly that by the time neighbors arrived to help, there was nothing left but smoldering ashes. 2 bodies were recovered, Sarah and one of the other servants who had accompanied Evelina from Willow Creek. But of Evelina and James, there was no trace. The sheriff's report was filled with contradictions. One of the surviving servants, Mary, claimed that she had witnessed something extraordinary on the night of the fire. According to her, Evelina had handed James over to a group of men who had emerged from the sea, their eyes glowing with the same unnatural amber hue as the child's. "They came for him," Mary said, her voice trembling, just like Miss Evelina said they would. "They came from the sea, and she gave him to them. She handed him over willingly." The sheriff, though disturbed by the woman's testimony, dismissed it as the ravings of a traumatized mind. He attributed the fire to Evelina's unstable mental state, but the damage had been done. The whispers grew louder, and the mystery surrounding the disappearance of the Bogard family only deepened. In the years that followed, Thomas Bogard withdrew from public life entirely. He sold Willow Creek and moved away, never to return. His name, once synonymous with wealth and power, faded into obscurity. However, the land where Willow Creek once stood was not forgotten. In the decades that followed, strange things continued to happen. The stone wall Thomas had commissioned to be built along the eastern boundary of the property was repeatedly damaged, always in the same location and always under the full moon of September. No one could explain why, but the repairs were always made quickly and silently, as if something or someone was watching. In 1961, an anthropologist named Dr. Marcus Wilson discovered records that shed new light on the mystery of the Bogard family. The documents reveal that the child, James, was not human, but something far older. The journals of Elenina, which had been hidden for years, spoke of her belief that James was a vessel, a child of the sea, brought forth to reclaim a birthright long forgotten. And as for Thomas, his final words were recorded in a letter to his brother. He was right not to trust his eyes, but wrong not to trust hers. To this day, the site of the old Willow Creek Plantation remains a place of whispered legend. The stone wall stands as a reminder of a dark and ancient power that once walked the earth, a power that can never truly be sealed away. And the child born with eyes like no other, his legacy lingers, waiting for the day when the boundary between the land and the sea finally crumbles completely.